I stood there, betrayed, humiliated, ruined. His voice echoed, "We're done." My heart raced, but my mind whispered, "No, this isn't the end. He thinks I'm broken, but he has no idea what I'm planning next." The moment I saw my suitcase tossed onto the front lawn, I knew my life would never be the same. The door slammed shut behind him, and I stood there frozen as neighbors peeked through their blinds, ready to devour the unfolding drama. My marriage was over, shattered in the most spectacularly public way, and I had nowhere to go. But what neither my husband nor anyone else knew was that this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. What would you do if everything you thought you had was ripped away in an instant? Stick with me as I share how I turned the worst day of my life into an opportunity for something greater. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories just like this one. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. I stood on the front lawn, my suitcase half-zipped, teetering on the edge of spilling its contents into the grass. A light breeze brushed against my face, mocking the warmth that was once this home. My husband's angry voice still rang in my ears as the door slammed shut behind me. The sound of it felt final, like a gavel hitting the judge's bench, sentencing me to exile. For the first time in years, I felt utterly alone. But what he doesn't know is this isn't the end of my story, not by a long shot. Rewind a few months, back to when the cracks in our marriage were just fissures, not the gaping chasm they've become. David, my husband, was a creature of routine. He woke at 6 a.m. every day, ran the same 3-mile loop, drank his coffee black, and disappeared into his office until dinner. For years, I loved his predictability. It felt like safety, like certainty. But over time, it began to feel more like a prison, each day indistinguishable from the last. I wasn't blameless. I'd let the spark between us flicker and dim too. Our dates became rare, our conversations superficial. When I tried to bring up how I felt, how disconnected we were, he would wave it off, tell me I was overthinking. "This is what marriage is," he'd say. "You can't expect it to feel like the honeymoon forever." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was selfish for wanting more. It was on a particularly mundane Thursday when I first met Matthew. I was at a local cafe, sipping on my overpriced latte and scrolling through emails. Matthew was sitting a few tables away, engrossed in a book. He wasn't the kind of man you'd call classically handsome, but there was something magnetic about him. Our eyes met briefly when he looked up to take a sip of his coffee. He smiled. I smiled back. It was innocent enough. "Good book?" I asked, surprising even myself. I wasn't the type to strike up conversations with strangers, let alone a man who made my pulse quicken with a single glance. "Depends," he replied, closing the book halfway to show me the cover. "Do you like a little mystery?" There it was, that word, mystery. The very thing my life had been lacking for years. We chatted for only a few minutes, but something shifted in me that day. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was genuinely interested in what I had to say. Matthew didn't glance at his phone or check his watch. He leaned in, hanging on every word, making me feel like I was the only person in the room. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I wouldn't see him again. But I did. The next time was an accident, or so I told myself. I'd gone back to the same cafe, secretly hoping he'd be there, and he was, sitting at the same table with the same book. This time, he waved me over before I even had the chance to order my coffee. "Let me guess," he said as I sat down. "You're a cappuccino kind of woman." "Close," I replied, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "Vanilla latte." "Sweet," he teased, and I couldn't help but laugh. We talked for over an hour that day. He was a writer working on his first novel, and I found his passion intoxicating. He asked me about my life, about my hopes, my dreams, the things that made me tick. No one had asked me those kinds of questions in years, not even David. It wasn't until I checked my phone and saw the time that I realized how long we'd been sitting there. "I should go," I said, gathering my things. But Matthew reached across the table and touched my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity up my arm. "I'd like to see you again," he said, his voice low and sincere. I hesitated, torn between the life I had and the one he seemed to offer, a life of passion, of being truly seen. Eventually, I nodded. Over the next few weeks, we began meeting regularly. At first, it was just coffee. Then it was lunch. And then, one night, it was more. I hadn't planned for it to happen. I'd gone to his apartment to return a book he'd lent me, and one thing led to another. I wish I could say I felt guilty, but in that moment, as his lips met mine and his hands explored places long forgotten, I felt alive. For the first time in years, I felt like myself. That night, lying beside him, I realized how far I'd drifted from the woman I used to be. I'd spent so long trying to fit into the mold of the perfect wife, the perfect partner, that I'd forgotten who I was beneath it all. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and mine was no exception. It was a Saturday evening when David caught me. I'd been careless, leaving my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. He never snooped. He wasn't the type, but a notification popped up just as he walked by. A message from Matthew. The fight that followed was explosive. David accused me of everything, of betrayal, of selfishness, of destroying our family. I didn't deny it. How could I? He had all the evidence he needed. By the time he finished yelling, he'd made up his mind. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and final. "Take your things and leave." And so here I was, standing on the lawn with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered sense of self. But as I looked back at the house we'd built together, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. David may have thrown me out, but he had no idea what I was capable of. He had no idea what I was planning. I didn't leave the lawn right away. Instead, I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the shadows in the windows of the house that used to be my home. David's silhouette moved from room to room, his agitation evident even from this distance. My suitcase sat at my feet, its cheap plastic wheels sinking into the soft earth. The absurdity of it all struck me. Years of marriage reduced to a single, hasty expulsion. I could hear my neighbor, Mrs. Lee, peeking through her blinds. She was the neighborhood busybody, and I imagined her phone buzzing as she updated the gossip circle in real time. The humiliation burned hotter than David's anger, but I refused to give her or anyone the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. As the night deepened, I replayed the confrontation in my mind, the way his face had turned red when he saw the text, the guttural sound of betrayal in his voice when he demanded to know, "How long has this been going on?" I could have lied, but what was the point? I wasn't proud of my actions, but I wasn't going to diminish them either. Matthew had given me something I didn't know I needed, something David had stopped giving me a long time ago. 3 months. I had admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes had narrowed, his jaw tightening in a way that was almost inhuman. 3 months? He spat. And you didn't think to tell me before letting me live like a fool? I didn't answer. What could I say? That it wasn't about him, not entirely? That Matthew was a symptom of problems neither of us wanted to acknowledge? It wouldn't have mattered. David had already decided that I was the villain in our story. A car sped by, its headlights briefly illuminating my face. I blinked against the brightness and looked down at my phone. The screen was dark. No messages, no missed calls. Not from David, of course, but not from Matthew either. The silence from him stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. I checked the time, 9:43 p.m., and realized I couldn't just stand there all night. I grabbed my suitcase and started walking. The sound of the wheels scraping against the pavement was loud in the stillness, and it echoed in my ears like a warning. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Not in this neighborhood, not in this life. 3 months earlier, when I met Matthew at the cafe that first time, it felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on me. I wasn't looking for anything, or at least that's what I told myself. I was just a woman who wanted to enjoy a coffee in peace, away from the monotony of a life that had become too predictable. He wasn't like the men I usually noticed. David was clean-cut, orderly, and practical to a fault. Matthew, on the other hand, had an easy charisma that made him seem approachable yet unattainable all at once. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his stubble suggested he hadn't bothered to shave that morning. There was something intoxicatingly human about him. I hadn't planned to talk to him, but when our eyes met, the words slipped out of my mouth before I could stop them. "Good book?" I'd asked. He had smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. "It is," he'd said, "but I think the conversation we're about to have will be even better." It was a line, one I'm sure he'd used before, but I didn't care. For once, I wanted to be someone's focus, even if just for a moment. The moments turned into hours. Each encounter with Matthew felt like stepping into a parallel universe where I was the version of myself I'd always wanted to be. He didn't just ask me questions, he listened to my answers, laughed at my jokes, and made me feel like the most interesting woman in the room. We shared pieces of ourselves like puzzle pieces clicking into place. He told me about his failed marriage, how he'd spent years trying to make something work with someone who never really saw him. I told him about David, about how we used to talk about everything, our dreams, our fears, our future, until the conversations dried up, leaving nothing but silence in their place. "I think people get stuck," Matthew had said during one of our coffee dates. "They forget that relationships are supposed to evolve. Instead, they just settle into patterns." I'd nodded, his words feeling like a balm for wounds I hadn't realized were still bleeding. The first time we kissed, it wasn't planned. I'd gone to meet him for what I told myself would be the last time. The guilt had been gnawing at me for weeks, and I knew I couldn't keep living a double life. But when I saw him sitting there, his eyes lighting up as I walked in, I couldn't bring myself to end it. We'd been sitting on a bench in the park, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. I told him about a childhood memory, something insignificant, really, but he listened with the kind of attention that made it feel monumental. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," I'd said, laughing nervously. "Because you trust me," he replied, his voice soft. The air between us had shifted then, heavy with unspoken possibilities. When he leaned in, I didn't pull away. His lips were warm, his hands tentative but firm as they cupped my face. For the first time in years, I felt desired. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again, but deep down, I knew I was lying. Back to the present, I reached the end of the street and paused, looking back at the house one last time. The lights were off now, the windows dark and unwelcoming. It was no longer my home. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Matthew's number. My thumb hovered over the call button, but something stopped me. Would he even answer? And if he did, would he offer the comfort I needed or excuses I didn't want to hear? A notification popped up at the top of my screen. A text message from him. My heart leapt as I opened it, but the contents made my stomach drop. "Can't talk right now. I'll call you tomorrow." I stared at the message, the words blurring as tears welled in my eyes. I wasn't sure if they were tears of anger or heartbreak. Maybe both. Wiping my face, I squared my shoulders and began walking again. Matthew might not be the answer, but that didn't mean I didn't have one. David thought he'd won tonight, throwing me out like yesterday's trash. What he didn't know was that this wasn't my defeat. It was my rebirth. And I already had a plan. David's voice still echoed in my mind as I checked into the small, nondescript motel just outside of town. The receptionist barely glanced up from her phone as I handed over my credit card, her apathy a strange comfort. It was easier to pretend my life wasn't unraveling when no one cared enough to notice. The room was exactly what I expected. Beige walls, a sagging bed, and a faint smell of bleach that couldn't quite mask years of cigarette smoke. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and sank onto the edge of the bed, my body heavy with exhaustion. The weight of everything, the confrontation, the betrayal, the uncertainty of what came next, pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I pulled out my phone and stared at Matthew's text again. "Can't talk right now. I'll call you tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word felt like an empty promise. I wanted, no, needed answers now. What was he doing that was more important than me? Was he regretting everything? I hated the way my mind spiraled, filling in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. But more than that, I hated the gnawing realization that I'd built my escape plan around someone who might not be as reliable as I thought. 2 months earlier. "Thank you, Maisie," he offered, holding up a bottle of red. His smile was easy, unguarded, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Sure," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to me, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary. That touch, fleeting as it was, set my heart racing. I took a sip of the wine, the rich flavor grounding me even as the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. We sat on the couch, our knees almost touching. The conversation flowed as effortlessly as it always did, but there was an undercurrent to it now, a pull neither of us could ignore. I wasn't sure who moved first, if it was him leaning closer or me, but suddenly his lips were on mine, soft and searching. It should have felt wrong, it should have made me pull away, but it didn't. That night changed everything. Afterward, as we lay tangled in his sheets, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. There was no denying what I'd done. I'd crossed a line that I could never step back over, and yet I didn't feel regret. If anything, I felt alive, more alive than I had in years. "This is crazy," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Matthew turned to me, his expression soft. "Crazy doesn't mean wrong," he said, tracing lazy circles on my arm. "Sometimes crazy is exactly what we need." I wanted to believe him. In that moment I did. Present day. The sound of my phone vibrating pulled me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it from the nightstand, my heart leaping at the sight of Matthew's name on the screen. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," he said, his tone unusually curt. "I got your message. Are you okay?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. "David found out," I said finally. There was a long pause on the other end, the silence stretching uncomfortably. "That's Vaisieth unexpected," he said at last, his voice carefully neutral. "Unexpected?" I repeated, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Matthew, I don't have anywhere to go. I thought—" I cut myself off, unwilling to finish the sentence. "I thought you'd be there for me." "Look, I can't talk right now," he said, his tone clipped. "Let me figure some things out, and I'll call you tomorrow." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, anger, and hurt swirling in my chest. I'd risked everything for him, and now, when I needed him the most, he was nowhere to be found. 1 month earlier, the affair had grown reckless. Matthew and I stopped meeting in public, opting instead for stolen afternoons at his apartment. Each encounter felt like a high-stakes gamble, the thrill of getting caught only adding to the intensity. One afternoon, as I lay in his bed, my head resting on his chest, he began talking about the future. "You could leave him, you know," he said, his fingers tracing patterns on my back. The words sent a jolt through me. "Leave David?" He said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. "You deserve to be happy. You deserve more than whatever this is." I wanted to argue, to tell him that leaving wasn't that simple, but a part of me knew he was right. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for a long time. "What would that even look like?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "It would look like freedom. Present day." I spent the rest of the night staring at the cracked ceiling of the motel room, Matthew's words replaying in my mind. Freedom. It sounded so simple, so appealing, but now, with no home, no plan, and no clear support from him, freedom felt like an impossible dream. By morning, I knew I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. David's anger, Matthew's hesitation, they were both reminders that I'd given too much of my power away. That had to change. I got dressed, packed my things, and checked out of the motel. The world outside felt sharper, colder, as if daring me to prove I could survive it. I didn't have a concrete plan yet, but I had an idea. And if there was one thing I learned from this mess, it was that sometimes you had to step into the unknown to find your way. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city fading into rural backroads as I tried to clear my mind. The world outside my car window blurred into a kaleidoscope of green fields and gray skies. Each mile I traveled felt like a layer of my old life peeling away. But Matthew's indifference last night still sat heavy in my chest. I replayed our conversation in my head, dissecting every word, every pause. He'd been cold, distant. Not the man who'd promised me freedom and excitement. Not the man who had looked into my eyes and told me I deserved better. I couldn't shake the gnawing thought. Had I been nothing more than a convenient distraction for him? By the time I reached the edge of a small lakeside town, I realized I couldn't keep driving. My gas tank was nearly empty, and so was I. I pulled into a quiet diner, the kind with peeling paint and neon signs that buzzed faintly in the daylight. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food wrapped around me like a blanket. I slid into a booth near the window and stared at the menu without really seeing it. A waitress appeared, her face kind but tired, and took my order. Coffee. Just coffee. As I waited, my phone buzzed. My stomach tightened when I saw Matthew's name on the screen. For a moment, I debated whether to answer. I wanted to punish him for his coldness, to make him wait the way he'd made me wait. But my need for clarity outweighed my pride. "Hello?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Okay," he replied, sounding more like himself. The warmth in his tone was a small comfort. "I wanted to apologize for last night. I shouldn't have cut you off like that." I didn't say anything, letting the silence speak for me. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued. "About David finding out, and about what happens next." "And?" I asked, my voice flat. "And I want to help," he said, his sincerity unmistakable. "I know I didn't handle things well, but I'm here now. Tell me what you need." Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with caution. "I don't even know what I need," I admitted. "I just know I can't go back to him, not after everything." "Then don't," Matthew said firmly. "You're stronger than you think. You can start over." "Start over with what?" I snapped, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "I have no job, no money, no plan. I can't just rebuild my life from nothing." "Then let me help you," he said. "Come stay with me for a while. We'll figure it out together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that he meant what he was saying. But a small, skeptical part of me couldn't ignore the possibility that this was just another empty promise. Still, I didn't have many options, and for now, I needed a lifeline. "Okay," I said finally, "I'll come." 2 weeks earlier, it was a Saturday afternoon, and Matthew and I were lying on the couch in his apartment, our limbs tangled together. The curtains were drawn, and the room was filled with the soft hum of music. "This is perfect," I murmured, my head resting on his chest. "I wish we could just stay like this forever." "Why can't we?" he asked, his fingers lazily tracing patterns on my arm. "What's stopping you?" I sighed, the weight of reality creeping into the moment. "David, my life, everything. You don't have to keep living that life," he said, his voice steady but insistent. "You have choices." "Do I?" I asked, turning to look at him. "Because it doesn't feel that way." "You always have a choice," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "You just have to be brave enough to take it." Present day. I arrived at Matthew's apartment just before sunset, my nerves raw and my heart pounding. He opened the door almost immediately, his smile warm and welcoming. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything would be okay. "Morning," he said, sliding a mug toward me. "How'd you sleep?" "Okay," I lied, taking the coffee gratefully. In truth, I'd spent most of the night tossing and turning, my mind a storm of doubt and uncertainty. Matthew leaned against the counter, watching me over the rim of his mug. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. The question caught me off guard. "The plan?" he said, setting his mug down. "You can't stay here forever, you know." The words hit me like a slap. I knew I couldn't stay indefinitely, but hearing him say it so plainly made my chest tighten. I thought we were in this together," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please." "We are," he said quickly, softening his tone. "But you've got to figure out your next steps. I can help, but you have to take the lead." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. He wasn't wrong, but his words felt like a reminder of how precarious my situation was. I was untethered, with no clear direction and no one to lean on but a man who was already pulling away. 2 days later, I spent most of my time job hunting, scouring online listings and sending out resumes to anyone who might consider hiring someone like me, a woman in her late 30s with a degree she hadn't used in over a decade. The process was humbling, each rejection email chipping away at the fragile hope I was clinging to. Matthew, meanwhile, was increasingly absent. He claimed to be busy with work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding me. The warmth that had drawn me to him in the first place was fading, replaced by a polite distance that left me feeling more alone than ever. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through job listings, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Dave. "We need to talk. It's important." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard from him since the night he threw me out, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face him. But curiosity and a lingering sense of obligation got the better of me. I texted back, agreeing to meet him the following afternoon. The meeting. David was already seated when I arrived at the cafe, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. He looked tired, as if the events of the past week had worn him down as much as they had me. I slid into the seat across from him, my nerves jangling like loose wires. "You wanted to talk?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything," he said slowly, "about us, about what went wrong." I braced myself, expecting anger or blame, but instead, his voice was calm, almost resigned. "I'm not innocent in this," he admitted, surprising me. "I know I've been distant. I know I stopped trying a long time ago, but I didn't think..." I didn't think it was bad enough for you to. He broke off, running a hand through his hair. To look for something else. I didn't plan for it to happen, I said softly. But that doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't, he agreed, his eyes meeting mine. But I still want to understand. Was it just about him, or was it about us? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. It was about what I wasn't getting from us. I felt invisible, David, like I was just a part of the furniture in our lives. And Matthew, he made me feel seen. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. I guess I stopped seeing you too, he said quietly. I got so caught up in everything else that I forgot to pay attention to the one thing that mattered. The weight of his words settled over us, heavy and unspoken. For the first time in years, it felt like we were having an honest conversation, one stripped of pretense and defensiveness. Returning to Matthew's apartment. When I got back, Matthew was sitting on the couch, his laptop open and his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. He barely looked up as I walked in. How was it? He asked, his tone neutral. Hard, I admitted, sinking into the armchair across from him. But good, I think. We talked about a lot of things we should have talked about years ago. Matthew nodded, his focus still on his screen. That's good. The casual dismissal stung, but I didn't press. I was too drained to argue, too tired to analyze what it meant. As the days went on, the distance between us grew. Matthew was kind, but his attention was elsewhere. I began to wonder if he regretted inviting me into his space, if he was waiting for me to leave so he could go back to his life uninterrupted. It wasn't until one evening, when I overheard a phone call he didn't know I was listening to, that the truth hit me like a freight train. I don't know, man, he said, his voice low but clear. She's still here, and I'm trying to be supportive, but I didn't sign up for this. I thought it would be different. The words sent a chill through me, a painful confirmation of what I'd been fearing all along. I wasn't his priority, I wasn't his escape, I was his burden. Revelation. That night, as I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, the realization hit me like a thunderclap. I had been chasing validation from two men who couldn't or wouldn't give me what I needed. David had neglected me, and Matthew had used me, but the real betrayal wasn't theirs. It was mine. I had betrayed myself. I had spent so much time looking for happiness in others that I'd forgotten how to create it for myself. I'd given away my power, my agency, and my sense of self-worth, and it was time to take it back. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity that had eluded me for weeks. The realization that I'd been chasing validation from Matthew and even from David left me feeling hollow, but it also opened my eyes. I couldn't depend on anyone to rebuild my life for me. If I wanted freedom, if I wanted happiness, I stepped into the kitchen where Matthew was sipping his morning coffee. He didn't look up as I entered, his focus on his phone. The sight of him, the man I'd risked everything for, felt different now. The rose-colored lens through which I'd viewed him was gone, replaced by a stark understanding of who he really was. "Morning," I said, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. "Nice." "Morning," he mumbled, still scrolling. I leaned against the counter, watching him. "We need to talk." Those words made him look up, his expression wary. "What's on your mind?" he asked. "I've decided to leave," I said simply. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Leave? Where are you going?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but it's clear that staying here isn't the answer for either of us." He set his phone down, his expression softening. "You don't have to go. I mean, you can stay until you figure things out." "Matthew," I said, cutting him off, "be honest. Do you really want me to stay?" He hesitated, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. "It's okay," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I know this wasn't what you signed up for, and honestly, it's not what I need either." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Thank you for everything you've done," I continued, "but it's time for me to move on, packing up and moving forward." Back in the guest room, I packed my things with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't an act of defeat, it was an act of reclamation. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was running toward something, even if I didn't know exactly what it was yet. As I zipped up my suitcase, Matthew appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked, looking up at him. "For not being the person you needed me to be," he said, his voice tinged with regret. I shook my head, a small smile playing on my lips. "You don't have to apologize. This was never your responsibility." We shared a long, silent look before he nodded and stepped aside to let me pass. A new chapter. I spent the next few days in a small motel, piecing together the fragments of my life. I opened a separate bank account, something I should have done years ago, and began updating my resume. I scoured job boards, applied for positions that interested me, and even reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with. It wasn't easy. Some nights I lay awake questioning my decisions, wondering if I'd made a mistake by leaving David or if I should have fought harder to make things work with Matthew. But deep down, I knew the truth. The real mistake would have been staying in places where I wasn't valued. David reaches out again. One evening, as I sat at the tiny desk in my motel room, my phone buzzed. It was a text from David. "I know things are complicated, but I'd like to talk again. Let me know if you're open to it." I stared at the message for a long time, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to move forward without looking back, but another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times we'd shared, felt drawn to the possibility of closure. After a moment of hesitation, I texted back, "I'll meet you tomorrow." The final conversation. David and I met at a park near the house we used to share. It was a crisp, clear day, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharper, more alive. He was sitting on a bench when I arrived, and he stood as I approached, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice careful but sincere. I nodded, sitting down beside him. "What did you want to talk about?" He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left," he said. "About us, about everything that went wrong." I didn't respond, letting him continue. "I realized I wasn't really present in our marriage," he admitted. "I got so caught up in work, in routines, that I forgot to appreciate you, to show you that I still care." His honesty took me by surprise, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of the man I'd fallen in love with. "I'm not saying this to make excuses," he added quickly. "What you did hurt me, and it's going to take time to work through that. But I also know that I had a part in it, and I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. "I'm sorry too," I said softly, "for hurting you, for not being honest about how I was feeling sooner." He nodded, his jaw tightening as he processed my words. "Do you think there's a chance we could fix this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, the question weighing heavily on me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I think we both need time to heal, to figure out what we really want." David nodded, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "I can accept that," he said. "But if you ever decide you want to try again, I'm willing to do the work." I smiled faintly, appreciating his vulnerability. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." The first steps toward independence. As I walked away from the park that day, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. David's apology didn't erase the pain of the past. but it gave me the peace I needed to move forward. Over the next few weeks, I focused on building a life that was truly mine. I found a job at a nonprofit organization, one that aligned with my passions and gave me a sense of purpose. I rented a small but charming apartment in the city, filling it with things that made me happy: books, plants, art. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And as I settled into my new routine, I realized something important. I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. I didn't need Matthew or David to define me. I could stand on my own, build my own happiness, and create a life that felt authentic and fulfilling. Closing thought. Life didn't magically become perfect overnight, but it became mine. And as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the sun dip below the skyline, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: